Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Rare Book Room. My name is Nicholas, and I help direct the events here at Strand. For a little bit of history, the Strand was founded in 1927 over on 4th Avenue's Book Row by the Bass family. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled, and over the last 91 years, Strand is the sole survivor still run by the Bass family and still housing new and used books. Tonight, we're really excited to have with us two senior writers from Rolling Stone magazine with brand new books about some of the musicians who made the records and played the shows that have made rock and roll what it is today. Brian Hiatt, whose Bruce Springsteen, The Stories Behind the Songs, digs into the stories behind the boss's legendary hits like Dancing in the Dark and Thunder Road, and countless others, is also the host of Rolling Stone's podcast on SiriusXM, and has also written for Entertainment Weekly and MTV News. David Browne is the author of books on the Grateful Dead, Sonic Youth, Tim Buckley, and as of today, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the wild, definitive saga of rock's greatest supergroup. In addition to Rolling Stone, his work has appeared in the New York Times, Spin, The New Republic, and others. I can't wait to hear these two fantastic writers on some of the greatest musicians and songwriters to grace the stage. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David and Brian to the Strand.
High up.
Which one are you?
Yeah, I'm the one in the very high chair. Hi. How you doing? Good.
Thanks for coming out, everybody.
So we thought we were going to start by talking about the very minute moments of intersection between Bruce Springsteen and Crosby, Stills, and Nash. There are very few, but I think we know them all. The first one is a softball game.
Is a softball game, yeah. When we had this idea of, Brian's book came out a week ago, and mine, and we thought, well, we should do something together, and we thought that would be fun. But what did these two ensembles have in common? Bruce embodies like the East Coast and CSNY, even though some of them are from England, or so LA-ish. But yes, they did have some moments of intersection. And the one that I found in my research, you never know what you find when you're researching a book. And one of their associates of Crosby, Stills, and Nash Associates said to me, "Have you ever talked to this guy in the Road Crew? You should." I'd never heard of, and they were like, "Yeah, track him down, and he probably has some good stories." And this guy did. And at one point he said, "Did you ever hear about the baseball game?" And I said, "No. What was that?" And he said, "Well, in 1976 we played a game against the Bruce Springsteen team." And I said, "Really? Tell me more." And it turned out that David Crosby and Graham Nash had this guy in their crew, knew a guy who worked for Bruce Springsteen's crew. And they were going to be playing, Crosby and Nash would be playing a concert at the Garden State Arts Center. Anybody been to the Garden State Arts Center? PNC, now it's the PNC Bank Arts Center, which is a terrible name. But so there was only one problem. So it was a closed event. It was just for, it was not for the press. There were no photographers and all that. And so Bruce showed up with his team. Did you research the baseball team? And
because mine was focused on songs,
right,
we didn't really. There was
my job to get the trivia.
Yes, right. There was the Glory Days is the baseball song.
Exactly.
And I did confirm that Blinded by the Light. And Bruce did say this in his Storytellers, that when he says Madmen drummers, Vinny Lopez, Bummers, I don't know, and Indians in the Summer was his baseball team. It was his Little League team, and that's what he said, at least. And I did confirm in a very old issue of the Asbury Park Press or some local New Jersey newspaper that Bruce Springsteen was on a team called the Indians, and it was a champion team when he was and this wasn't when he was 11, this is when he was 15, so actually a pretty recent memory when he wrote Blinded by the Light. But anyway, we're going to talk about baseball mostly, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Right.
Well, by 1976, they were called the East Street Kings, and they were really good. And the problem is the Crosby and Nash team wasn't really a team. Graham Nash didn't know how to play baseball.
He had never seen a baseball before, I think.
He'd never seen it. He put the mitt on the wrong hand. Yeah. And they named their team the San Francisco Hoovers, which was not a drug reference at all.
Yeah.
And basically Bruce's team kind of kicked their butts, as I've discovered.
Bruce left for a couple innings?
He left for a couple innings and came back, and they weren't they weren't scoring and having enough runs. They weren't scoring enough with the East Street Kings, so he whipped them back up, and they really kicked the Crosby Nash team.
I mean, I think fitness level definitely. It's never really been a contest between these two acts, I think.
No, you don't really necessarily associate David Crosby with like a Jack LaLanne kind of situation.
And then the next was No Nukes, right?
There was No Nukes, which was a couple of years later, where you talk about it's 1979. Bruce is like reaching the apex at that point of his career, right? In some ways, he's about to record The River.
He was in the midst of, and in fact, part of that show, I believe he went back. Again, I don't get too much into live stuff because that's not the point of it, but it helped prompt him that he needed to expand what was going to be the Ties That Bind album into the River. But they basically, what's the story of how they invited him? Did you get into that or not really?
I invited Bruce?
Yeah.
To tell you the truth, no. I think it was just, he was, Jackson Browne was organizing it, and he and Bruce were friends. So there were, was out here on the East Coast, so they needed to get headlining acts for each of the 5 nights.
And of course, the whole thing was everyone thought that they were being booed when actually they were saying Bruce. And I forgot it was Tom Petty or someone who said, "What's the difference?" Which is a good point.
And meanwhile, Bruce was up there doing this, a pretty great set from what I've heard of it. And David Crosby is in the locker room where the athletes are in the Garden, having it duct taped up and cooking up freebase.
Yeah.
So they were at 2 very different points in their career at that point.
Yeah. And then we reached the end of the intersections almost with 1986, the Bridge concert.
Right. Neil Young and his wife Peggy started the school for disadvantaged kids and with the Bridge School, and they had their very first concert in 1986. It was all acoustic affair. And David Crosby had just gotten out of prison. So it's a recurring theme, but so Neil Young organized, invited his old bandmates for a reunion, and invited also Bruce and people like Don Henley, and they sang together.
Yeah, so you can see this on YouTube. Crosby, Stills, and Nash backed Bruce on Hungry Heart, and they did a really good job. They sang the Flo and Eddie Oohs and Ahs. And then they all sang Teach Your Children together. And Bruce is there. You can watch it on YouTube, and he's kind of just mouthing the words. It's just out of his... He either didn't know the song or it's out of his wheelhouse or something. But he's kind of just like... He's strumming along and like approaching the mic, sort of singing, but you can never hear him. So there you go. And that's... and then in your book, there's one more... when you talk about their performance at the rehearsal for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame anniversary concerts,
right.
Which you actually were physically there. You watched this.
I was physically there. So it's like 10 years ago. They were doing 3 nights of concerts at the Garden for the 25th anniversary of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and they were renting a big rehearsal space downtown for everybody, and everyone was kind of camped out in little rooms working on rehearsals. And I was covering the Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Friends segment. They invited Neil, and he didn't respond, so they
another theme.
Theme in the book. And at one point there was this big hubbub outside, and everyone's like, "What's going on?" And a bunch of us look outside, and Bruce has arrived, and the seas parted. And Graham Nash actually got up on a chair and took pictures of it.
So that's the end of the intersection. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
So
Brian, I just quickly have intersection. We first worked together at Entertainment Weekly, and we also grew up, although I'm a tad older, near each other in New Jersey. I was from Hazlitt.
You were Monmouth County as
Monmouth
well.
County,
yeah.
yes,
Monmouth County
yes,
represent.
Yes.
Yeah. But somehow you were never really. You were more of a California music fan. You weren't.
For some reason, yeah. People would talk about the romanticism of that area in Bruce's music, and it didn't strike me that way.
You weren't buying it.
I wasn't buying it at all. No.
And I was telling you earlier that before we ever met, I was unwilling to, in 1992 or so, as a 18-year-old, I was unwilling to admit at the time any weaknesses in the Human Touch and Lucky Town albums. I since will, as you've seen in the book, I since have budged on that point. But I remember reading a David Browne review in Entertainment Weekly when our copy came to the house, and you said they were very disappointing. And then like the next, I have my chronology wrong. A couple years later, you're like, this Hanson album, A+, and I was like, really, screw this guy. But I've since forgiven you, and actually, yeah, I think you're right. That Hanson album is very good.
I stand by the Hanson album.
Yeah.
I think Lucky Town is a little better than I gave it credit for, but Human Touch still spotty.
Flood. Bruce himself said to me that he wished he could have re-recorded it, and that in part the reason that he went on and did Lucky Town was because he felt that there was something missing in Human Touch. So so you and Bruce agreed, really. It's like you're best friends.
Exactly. Yeah. We talk about it all the time. So I was speaking of the creative process. I mean, Brian, it's a lead-off point to your book, which is a terrifically researched, thorough analysis of every song Bruce has written and recorded in chronological order. I learned a ton of stuff from this book, and I've heard all those records, but I guess for starters, just what made you decide to take that approach to writing a book about Bruce?
Basically, I can't lie, I was approached to do it, and this is what I've been saying is I was approached to do it, and I didn't really have time. We have our day jobs, and the reason I agreed to do it was essentially there've been actually a lot of these books that are every song by an artist. It's kind of been a format, and there's a couple of them that are really good. There's one about U2 where they actually talk to Bono and The Edge, and there's definitely a few that are good. And then there's a ton that are just sort of gather the information that's out there. It's nothing really new. And I was like, I basically couldn't bear the thought of someone else doing it and doing it that way. I said, well, here's an opportunity to actually dig in and get some new information about this stuff that people love. And
you
it really
actually
is part of
talked to some of the guys in the band.
Right. So I basically agreed to do it on the basis of that I would add to the historical record, and I hopefully think I did. Your book is what 400 or 500 pages long. I read all of it.
It's almost 5.
Yeah, almost 500 pages long. So I mean, and a longer project. At the same time, I did whatever 60 hours of interviews and a ton of research to try to make it fresh, and I hopefully even things that people. Even the songs that people have heard about a million times, there's some fresh detail. But that's basically why I took it on, because I'm crazy.
And who had the best, of all of you? You talked to Max and Nils Lofgren. Like who had the best memories and who had the most best recollections?
Max Weinberg not only had the best memory out of anyone I talked to, the most precise. He has one of the most precise memories of any human being I've talked to in general. And he said that it's actually he's quite aware of it. It's like apparently there's a family trait. The Weinbergs have spectacular photographic memories. So his level of detail. I mean, he's the only one who would, out of anyone, who might remember certain outtakes and the drum part he played on and where the drum part came from and what Bruce literally ate for breakfast that day. That's in the book. That's one of my favorite details. Is during.
Wait, you go back up. I don't remember that.
So there's a part where Bruce, and I think we're talking about 76 now, if I remember correctly. You can look in the book, but basically when Bruce had his sort of farmhouse out in, I think, Homedale, and they would go and rehearse every day. It's what you see in the Promise documentary where Bruce is shirtless and recording and playing these songs, and they'd go and they couldn't record, but they could rehearse every day, and they would do this every day. And what they would do is they would actually get to the house at like 2 p.m. and Bruce's like roommate / assistant, when the whole E Street Band had arrived, that's when they would wake Bruce up at like 2 p.m. And then he would have his breakfast, which was like according to Max, a bowl of sugary cereal with additional sugar added. A lot of genetics there.
Don't try that at home, kids.
Yeah, don't try it at home, or you would look like David Crosby. So yeah, I mean, to turn the tables on you, I mean, for a second, our narratives are so different because mine is, as I was saying to you before, is about the diligent work of one man and all the people who helped him over 40 years of just grinding away at draft after draft. Some of songs that never even came out. There's a song called White Town that didn't come out until 3 years ago. And you can go in the bootlegs, and he worked on like 50 versions of this song that never even came out. And so, and whereas your book,
talk about that for a second. We'll get back.
Okay.
All right. I want to stay on that because it's interesting because. One of the things that was reinforced to me in Brian's book is that, making records for Bruce, especially starting with Born to Run, seemed like a torturous experience. Like he just, it's not.
This is complicated, and I'm going to remember to get back to my thing about you because there was a connection. But yeah, I mean, the torture, it was various kinds of torture because at the beginning, the first 2 albums weren't torturous at all, especially the first one just banged it out. They barely gave it any thought at all, and you can kind of hear it in the arrangements. And the second album seems to have been kind of a joy to make. And then the torture started with Born to Run. And the torture... the kinds of torture varied over the years, and I'll try to keep it short, but basically, like I'm Born to Run, the torture was getting both the sound of the songs right and the lyrics of the song right, and also the recording process. And so it was just brutal. He was starting from scratch and like sort of reestablishing his sound with new musicians. Max and Roy just joined the band. And then the new kind of torture started with Darkness. Darkness was they couldn't get the sound right, and they couldn't decide which songs they wanted. So they recorded song after song after song after song. That's where that nightmare started, although it's kind of a dream for those of us who got to hear all those songs. And then The River was just like choosing the songs, really. It was just because they had so many songs. And then Born USA was, again, like an unbelievable amount of songs that they had to choose between. And then it sort of changed from there, but yes. But what I was going to say is my book is about this one man's diligent efforts. Your book is about these guys who made one perfect album, one near perfect album, and then spent many years trying to get back to the garden and being total screw-ups at times along the way. So it's a fascinating, it's an unusual. I think that's one of the things I like most about the book is it doesn't hit some of the conventional arcs or marks. Their story, both arcs and marks. It doesn't have a conventional arc, and it doesn't hit many of the conventional marks because there's triumphant moments that, later on, like I would say the tour with Neil Young with Let's Impeach the President and all that, reclaiming their purpose. But there's also like a lot of just ups and downs and not being able to get their stuff together. I'm trying not to curse, but they are the most dysfunctional band possibly of all time by some measures.
They are. It is like a musical family tree of people who, it's almost like relatives who get together for Thanksgiving and haven't seen each other in a while, and they kind of get along for a while. Then by the end of the evening, some of those old tensions come up, and they're arguing, and then they go back and to their separate corners, and then they kind of reconvene for the next holiday. And each of these guys is also like an archetype in a way too. I think that's one of the things about them that's always interested me, that you had David Crosby is the kind of like the loudmouth counterculture rebel guy, and people kind of read into it, so connected with that. And then you had Stephen Stills, who was this really incredibly driven careerist who would stay up for days and days at a time recording songs.
And that's only his first incarnation. Then he becomes like a deranged lunatic, basically, right? I mean,
yeah, it has its impact on him after years. And Graham Nash is this very courtly British gentleman, and the level-headed guy in the group. A guy always had the nice house, and to the point where he renovated a Victorian mansion in San Francisco that had like a live pond with goldfish in the bathroom. And as a guest there told me, who stayed, like, it's not the kind of bathroom you go into at night, like in the dark, you can do that. And then Neil Young was to use the title of one of his songs, The Loner. He was the non-committal, like the guy who would just go his own way and occasionally intersect with them and had his own path. And I think their fans read themselves into each of those archetypes at various points. But it also made for an often unharmonious group as a result of those.
Well, they could never get it together all at the same time. If Crosby was doing better, someone else had a drug problem.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And lining up all those ducks it was never easy to begin with. When they first started the group, I was researching and came across this reference to when they were recording their first album as Crosby, Stills, and Nash, but it was announced in Billboard as Stills, Crosby, Nash.
Right.
And I went, really? So I asked David Crosby and Graham Nash in interviews about that, and they were like, yeah, we had to talk Stephen. He wanted to be the leader, so we had to talk him out of it. We said, it sounds better. It only sounds good as Crosby, Stills, and Nash. It doesn't sound good as Stills, Crosby, Nash. And of course, David Crosby had to add to me. He goes, but also, I was in the Byrds. I had the hits. The people knew me. So, right from the beginning, there was a little tension. Although I think the tension helped in a way. They weren't, these guys are often thought of as like soft rock or yacht rock or whatever these terms are. But they were not like America or something, these knockoff groups. There was a bristling tension underneath them that I think made the music kind of deeper and richer in a way.
Well, it's amazing that they're literally among the best harmony singers of all time, and there's absolutely no harmony in the group except for
that's the thing about the story that's fascinating. Always fascinated me that you'd hear this great music, and then underneath it, and you'd hear the stories about what was going on at the time. Like, for example, there's one of their big hits is Southern Cross from 1982. And that's billed as a Crosby, Stills, and Nash record. But David Crosby isn't really on it because they couldn't find him when they were trying to make the album. He was deep into his heroin addiction. This was 1980, 81. They didn't have cell phones, they didn't have computers. He had a phone in his house in Mill Valley. And occasionally, Graham Nash would occasionally call the house, and some woman who didn't know would answer and say, "Is David there?" And they go, "Oh, he's at the beach." And he knew that was a total lie because David Crosby never went to the beach. So this album comes out in Southern Cross. It's this, it's now like sort of a soft rock standard, and people have covered it and all this. But they just went ahead and recorded it without him because even when they found him and dragged him into the studio, he was not in great shape, and he'd be freebasing in the back room, and it was just a nightmare thing. But you wouldn't know that from listening to the record. I think they got Art Garfunkel to sing on it instead, actually.
Yeah, I like when you said that Art Garfunkel, as we know that there's a lot of stories about Art Garfunkel being the most humorless man in rock and roll, and so they said, when Art's here, you guys better behave. But the other thing is, Crosby also at one point turned his vocal booth into like a freebasing area, right?
Yeah, there were some dark times there, to say the least. He could barely make a record, without surrounding himself with the paraphernalia. They called it Dave's Chemistry Set. That was the name of the. There were all kinds of crazy stories about that time. They hired Smokey Wendell, who was John Belushi's security guy, the guy who was hired to keep drugs away from John Belushi. They hired
due to his great success on that
very
front,
successful. Yeah. In fact, when they brought him over to Crosby to meet him, and they said, "Hey, this is Smokey. He's going to be working with you." And Crosby nodding. He worked with Belushi, and Crosby was like, "What?" He had just died a few months before. So, it's amazing. David Crosby is alive and actually really productive these days. He's going to be 78 this year, and he's just recorded 4 albums in a row, and it's a remarkable renaissance.
Making good music. He's making good music now.
He is.
I guess at least one of his organs has actually been replaced. It's part of one of the narrative.
He's 25 years into a new liver, so it's a little dicey. As
he
himself will admit.
Tune up, yeah. But, yeah. Why is he still alive? Because you read this book. He was I'm not even joking. He was carrying around weapons. He was, he was riding a motorcycle high. He was, he
pushed it as much as about anybody could push it. Yeah. It's true, and it's those genes things. Why is Keith Richards still alive? There are certain people. What's weird about Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young is that all these people who worked with them, like their former backup musicians and exes and musicians, they're all starting to drop one by one, but those 4 guys are still standing. It's a remarkable thing.
And I wanted to ask about Neil, because Neil Young never comes off incredible. He always comes off as brilliant in any book that features Neil Young, whether he's the central character or not. But he never comes off, as maybe like the guy you'd want to be your best friend. He clearly has. He's a little bit of he's so dedicated to his art that he will discard you if you're in the way or if he's done with you. And it's fascinating and one of the things about your book that's fascinating is you get to see Neil through the eyes of the other 3 guys. And for them, he was like this distant god who always might put his blessing upon them, but not necessarily, and then might snatch it away. And it's just it's must have been very weird for them to live with him like that. Or not with him for all those years. Yeah,
they're just hanging on him, waiting on him to give the go-ahead for anything. He's the guy who makes them the most money, gives them the most exposure, and adds that extra element. But he only does it when he wants to, and usually, if it helps him in some way. When they reunited in 1974 for a big stadium tour, which was the first time a rock band had done a whole summer tour where they just played baseball stadiums. It was a huge deal. And I reached out to one of Neil's friends who was on that tour and is still in touch with him. And I said, well, I don't understand why then? Why did he pick that year, that moment to decide after 4 years, okay, I'm going to go out with these guys again? And the guy said, well, you have to understand, Emil just bought the ranch, and he needed $24,000 for the asphalt, for the roads. And he went through the checklist of everything that, that Neil needed for the ranch. And, and it's very frustrating for the other guys because they want to keep making music with him. But it's just the way he is. He's mercurial. He moves from this to that and one project to the other. And unlike Bruce, to get back to Bruce,
we're it's like volleyball here. We're going, go ahead, ask some Bruce stuff. Go ahead.
Well, there were so many fascinating stories about the early versions of songs that I didn't know about in your book that I learned. Like, for example, take us through Glory Days and how different that is now.
So Glory Days had like a lot of these songs, there's sometimes multiple origins. Bruce, I think writers of all stripes actually can learn a lot from Bruce because of his use of drafts and his willingness. There's, people talk about the shitty first draft that you have to put out. And sometimes that can be really hard. You want to just revise, and before you get, you never want that full draft to exist. But he always finished his drafts. Some of them, as he once said to me, like he's willing to write a draft that he knows is full of purple prose and horrible, and the challenge is getting that to a place where he's happy with it. And then you can worry, the next 8 levels later, you can worry about whether he wrote a classic. But he's willing to just go and go and go and go. Again, like I said, even on songs that never came out. And sometimes I think it's a song called Stockton Boys, that another one of these songs that he worked on a million times. That's never come out at all. Even on a box set, there's no Stockton Boys release. But this is a song he worked on for what seems like months.
That was from his Celtic album.
Yeah, right. No, the Celtic album came out actually. But it was about a town named Stockton where down there you don't count. I mean, it feels very Brucey already. Maybe it was too Brucey, but there was if I remember correctly, because I'm not looking at the book, there was one draft of Stockton Boys actually contained a couple lines from Glory Days, and then he plucked, as he would, and that's one of the things I think you can learn from him, is he would just generate stuff, and he would be willing to kill an entire song if there was one line in it that could be a germ for something else. And you see that happen a lot, actually. And also, he has songs that would split off into multiple songs. There'd be one song that might be the origin for 2 different songs. Like the song "Shut Out the Lights" and "Born USA" actually came from the same other song. This interesting generative process. Again, I think there's a ton to be learned from him. But so for Glory Days, so that was the beginning. And then the other key decision that he made in Glory Days was there was a verse, and you can hear it. It's in the take that's on the record. There's a bootleg version of that very take. It's not even a different take, where he had this verse that was like, "My old man, he ain't never had any glory days," and he's talking about, and it brought the whole thing down. It was just like it was off theme of the song. The song is about obviously passing time and mortality. Instead, he's like talking about his dad in the factory again, and which just shows how he's always drawn like a magnet to these central themes. And sometimes he knows better, and he's like, this is not, it's like Walter Sobchak in Big Lebowski. Like, this has nothing to do with Vietnam. Don't so I think even he's like maybe no factory in this one. So it's like so I mean, but this is a fascinating case because he went as far as to include that verse in while that verse, that version, the one where you can hear Little Steven playing mandolin, all happened live in the studio, and they just snipped it out. So you can go and hear the bootleg, and the song would have not worked had they not snipped it out. So it's a good example.
Yeah, and there's so many great little moments in the book. Like, tell the story of like when, was it Land of Hope and Dreams, when Bruce hears Clarence's posthumous solo? Or was that like kind of an emotional moment?
Yeah, I mean, well, Ron Aniello, whose name I have tremendous trouble pronouncing, but is the greatest guy, and he's the Bruce's current producer, and he basically Clarence died during the making of Wrecking Ball, and they were supposed to get him in to play sax on the song Land of Hope and Dreams, and he literally went in for a surgery like while they were talking about doing it, and then he ended up in a coma, and then he passed away. And so Ron was sort of alone in the studio while Bruce was going to the funeral and stuff, and he realized that he could, and this is an example of, Ron is like a real computer whiz. He's both if people wonder why Bruce has this guy working for him, it's because he can really do everything. I went to the studio in Colts Neck with Ron on Bruce's property. It was like Home Alone. Bruce wasn't there. We were there. And Ron played me a lot of the basic tracks for these albums and showed me just how much he did, which is like if there was a messed up guitar part, Ron could replay it. If there's, an edit to be done, Ron can do that in Pro Tools. He's a very like sort of multi-talented musician, engineer, producer type guy. But basically in this case, what he did was he took a live version of Land of Hope and Dreams, which was a very different arrangement, different everything, different key, different tempo. And through digital wizardry, he pulled out Clarence's solo, digitally altered it so it was in the new key, made the timing fit, and pulled it in. And that's what you hear in Land of Hope and Dreams. And Bruce came back, and Ron played him the song, which he didn't know was going to include this sort of magical posthumous saxophone. And Bruce cried. It sounds like a pretty powerful moment. And it also shows like that's someone really doing their job. Like this is someone, like Ron did his job, and that's I think Bruce inspires that kind of dedication. There was no freebasing in this studio. There was the hard work.
Just sugary cereals.
Yeah.
Just sugary cereals. What was Bruce's studio like?
I mean, I had been there. I'd been in the building before. Basically, if you get to do an interview on Bruce's property, that's the building you go to. You've seen it in various documentaries and stuff. So the couple times I'd interviewed him in person in New Jersey, that was where I went. But it's basically like a carriage garage on his property. It's not his house. It is a house on his property, like a little former garage that I guess Patty converted. Patty Scalfa, his wife, converted to like a really beautiful little studio that was a completely really professional studio, blonde wood, beautiful instruments, beautiful equipment, and you can really imagine why. From what I'm told, you talked about the torture of recording. That ended for him around, certainly in the 2000s in general, but once he had this studio and once he had Ron on his property, I think all the agony went away because now he can wake up and just go and record. In one case, I really like the story of Easy Money, which has been told, but I got a little more detail, which is they were recording an entirely different album, and Bruce, I guess, went out for a drink at a bar, and which is interesting. I guess when I could have had a drink on the property, but since he's Bruce, he left and had a drink like a person at a bar. Came back, and I guess on the way back, the song Easy Money like literally jumped into his head, and he came literally running into the studio, and Ron and his assistant were like packing up for the night. They had locked the door, and Bruce almost like knocked the door off its hinges because he was so like it was locked. Just like let me in, and he came in, and he's like turn on right now, and he like grabbed the acoustic guitars and sang Easy Money, and that's how the whole Wrecking Ball album started. But,
wow. A different experience than when CSMI tried recording a record in 1974, and Stephen Stills and Graham Nash got into a whole argument, and Stephen Stills tried to actually slash up the tape, and Graham Nash's buddy had to evict Stills from Nash's own home studio in his basement in San Francisco. Very different.
I want to talk about Stephen Stills for a minute. I called him Stephen Stills because I knew about Stephen Stills, like the total wild man. Stephen Stills, who allegedly claimed for a while to have fought in Vietnam, which he did not, which he treated very nicely and lightly in the book. Who among us has not claimed to be fought in Vietnam when we didn't? It was the 70s were quite a decade. But beyond, so I kind of knew that side of him.
They call it the missing years.
Yeah, the missing years.
And that's a joke in the band.
So I knew all that, but what I didn't actually know was the sort of brilliant Stephen Stills that you see, especially in the first album, who really kind of made the instrumental core of that record. And that I was really interested to see. And so how did he go from that to that? And the answer is just cocaine, isn't it? Yeah.
There was a lot of that back then. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to, kind of reinforce a little bit in the book was, that he really was the driving force, and he was just obsessed with making music. And there was a reason he wanted his name first in the group, because he was a multi-instrumentalist. He could play everything. The other guys couldn't. And, he would do things like, one of the songs on the first Crosby, Stills, Nash record that almost didn't make it was Long Time Gone, which Crosby had written about after Bobby Kennedy was killed. And they just couldn't get the arrangement down. They tried all different things. And finally, Stills was, he said just to the other guys, just go home for the night. Weirdly enough, I asked Nash about that. I said, do you remember that? He goes, yeah. And I said, Stills said you guys went out for burgers. He's like, no, we didn't go out for that. And I'm like, what did you go out for? And he didn't want to say. Right. 50 years later. Right. Very mysterious. You read a lot into that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they come back at dawn, and Stills is up all night, and he plays them. He presses the record button, and it's the version we hear with that throbbing organ and that great gnarly guitar. He played all that, stayed up all night and did that, and they were just completely blown away by it. And so he had that I think he's a deeply kind of insecure, shy guy, and he has a lot of surface braggadocio, but I think he really feels like he has always had to prove himself, and I think he pushed and pushed and pushed to himself.
One thing, a broader thing I wanted to think of, that I thought of reading and wanted to ask you about is just, they had like a couple years at the beginning, again, when they were very current and very much of their era. And then very quickly, suddenly it was like they were walking symbols of the death of the hippie dream. That happened like right away. And that's kind of tarred them forever. So how much of that is fair, and how much, because you do some of that yourself. I mean, it's hard not to think that when you see Crosby in court and stuff. Although, again, he's turned around the narrative by making some of the best music of his life right now. Right. But still, how much of that is fair when people kind of constantly paint them that way? Like, look, this is where it all became greed, and this is where it all went to seed. And even Neil himself has used them as that example. So,
yeah, in some ways. Well, you're forgetting Graham Nash's synth pop album in the 80s.
Yeah, I actually literally made a note. I've got to hear that. Is that out of print, or can I get it on streaming?
It's out of print, yes. It's on Spotify, I believe. Okay. So everything lives on Spotify. Well, part of it was that they did symbolize that era so much, and partly because the people around them wanted them to. For example, at Woodstock, if you were to see the Woodstock movie now, it opens with one of their songs, A Long Time Gone. It ends with Woodstock, and they have a big moment in there of Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. That was only the second show they'd ever done. They were not a superstar group, but their people like David Geffen, who was their co-manager, made it. They were like, no, you have to amplify this group, showcase this group in this movie, and use these songs on the soundtracks and all this kind of stuff. And so they were so instantly identified with that world. With that hippie scene right away, and a huge movie and a soundtrack as well as their own work, and I think they kind of reveled in that. It's kind of who they were. I mean, they're still old hippies. Yes. They really are. I mean, Stephen Stills is a lot more conservative. He's actually the one who would say in interviews in the early 70s, well, maybe we shouldn't have a revolution. Maybe we should go to the polls. He would actually, but he would get total crap for it because people would be like, "You're selling out, man." So it was a no-win situation.
I like how Neil claimed not to have been at Woodstock falsely. What's up with that?
Exactly. Yeah, and actually, there's if you see if this is a famous story, but if you see the movie Woodstock, he was there performing with them. But if you see the movie, when they start performing, you hear the announcer like, "Ladies and gentlemen, Crosby, Stills, Nash." Like he had them edit out and Young. So you don't even hear a mention of his name in the movie at all. It's a very strange thing. And that was the first sign. He had just joined the group a month before, which I think was the first sign that he had some commitment issues, which is the story of that band, unfortunately.
Go through. Can you? This is actually sort of a test. This is a quiz. Can you go through quickly all the configurations in which they made albums, starting from the first album?
Oh wow. Sure. Well, it started actually as Crosby and Stills. They were called the Frozen Noses. Again, that's not a drug reference, kids. Just saying, not a drug reference. Then it was Crosby.
They didn't know coke was bad for you back then.
This is true.
That is actually true.
In their defense, it was not seen as an addictive. They thought it was
substance. Like medicine. Yeah, but
it was just seen as something that would give you a boost, like one of those energy drink deals. But it was not. It was not. That's one thing. Many things I learned. Yeah, it was not seen as addictive. So it's Crosby and Stills. Then it was Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Then it was Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Then they were separate. Then it was just Crosby and Nash. Then it was the Stills Young band. Then it was Crosby, Stills, and Nash again. Then it was Stills and Nash when they tried to make that album without David Crosby. And then it just circled back to Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and then Crosby and Nash. And I should have had a flow chart in the book. I realized I'm missing.
That was good.
Well, what do you think what is your favorite Bruce era?
Wow. Well, my go-to answer for favorite Bruce album, I always have to say Darkness.
And why?
And well, I think one of the things I realized, sometimes you realize things that are kind of obvious when you're doing projects like this that should be obvious, but are kind of big realizations. It's like there's certain themes you think of as Bruce themes, for instance, in the case of my project, where it's like writing about his dad, writing about the workaday life, writing about social class, and then you realize, like, oh my God, actually, the first hint to that isn't until the song "Night, I'm Born to Run." Suddenly, it's like you get, there's a guy going to work at the sound of the bell. It's the first time there's a job in any Bruce song. There's no job up until then. No one has a job. It's actually true. The only one who has a job is the soldier in Lost in the Flood, and even that guy is just, and then even that guy, if depending on how you read the song, he might be a race car, just a race car driver for fun or whatever. But and then I guess I'm Born to Run, like in the day we sweat it out. I guess they're working, but it's very vague. But and someone pointed out that there's a dad. The first dad on any Bruce album, I guess, is on Rosalita. But that's not his dad. That's just a dad. That's the dad of the underage girl he's dating. I don't know. But so on Darkness is where it all comes together. Suddenly the sound came together on Born to Run, and the themes come on Darkness. And for me, Darkness, there's just a sort of a ferocity and the stripped down nature of it. I think it just makes it one of the greatest rock albums of all time. And there's moments there's things like I've listened to this studio record way before I ever started writing this book. I've listened to the studio recording of Something in the Night, a billion times, and it was really interesting to hear from Max of how live it was. And there's things like Max would be like, you can hear when Bruce signals to me and it stops. And it's, I don't remember the exact details, but it's like that thing I was listening to, that's a moment, that's a real live moment captured in these people's lives and careers. It wasn't something manufactured. And that's something, I think in the case of both of our books, and the thing why people are still interested in this old music is it's like, as great as this stuff is now, it's very rare that it's going to capture a moment of real, in-the-moment interaction between musicians that happen live in a room. It's just not the way things are made anymore, and It's just an extraordinary thing that then now we're still hearing those things. But yeah, for me, Darkness. Yeah.
And it reminds me of one of my favorite Bruce songs on the record, "Adam Raised a Cain," and there's a great quote in there from Chuck, from his engineer, right, Chuck Plotkin, about Bruce describing what he wanted that song to sound
that actually,
like.
It's funny. That was the same thing. That's also in the documentary, but it is.
It's okay.
So Bruce. But basically, what's interesting to me is what happens. Like Chuck Plotkin, who was part of Bruce's production team from basically started as a mixer in '78 and then went all the way from 2000 as part of the actual production team. And he talked to me for 10 hours, which was amazing. And I got, and one of the things Chuck likes to talk. Back then, Bruce used to talk.
We like that.
Yes, and we like that. Greatest guy, but back then, Bruce used to like to talk. He used to like to talk for like 5 hours about one lyric or, one song, should it be in, should it be out. Back then, it was like that was part of the torture of the process. But basically what Chuck did really quick is Chuck was not a record mixer. He was not a mixer of records. He was a producer, but mixing a record is a very specific thing. It requires certain technical skills, and for the most part, you want a professional mixer. But basically, like Jimmy Iovine, who also talked for the book, and is fascinating that someone who's literally a billionaire now and made Beats headphones still wanted to talk about literally what dial he turned in 1977. But he remembers every dial.
He was not doing drugs during those sessions.
Yeah,
is
right.
What you're saying.
So. But basically, Chuck came. They had a hunch that Chuck could do it. Chuck came in, and on Adam Raised a Cain, first of all, Bruce said he wanted it to be like a jump cut from the first song is Badlands from Adam Raised a Cain. It'd be like you're at a beautiful picnic, and then you cut to a dead body.
Yeah,
and that was
a couple having a picnic to a mutilated dead body under a tree.
Yeah,
is how we wanted it to sound.
Chuck was like,
very vivid.
Yes.
To quote.
Chuck was like, first of all, these people are crazy, and second of all, I don't know how I'm going to do that. But what he actually did, and that's one of the things that's that I've never seen reported before, is he did something crazy, which is he took Roy Bittan's beautifully recorded grand piano part, and used something called an eventide harmonizer, which was an early piece of digital equipment. It's the same thing that makes those weird drum sounds on the Bowie Berlin album on Low and stuff like that. And he knocked Roy Bittan's piano out of tune. That's what you hear on the finished record. Is my ear isn't precise enough to hear it. After he told me, I could kind of hear it. But so he, among other things, that's what he did. He knocked Roy's piano out of tune. And he's like, this is crazy. I'm getting fired. And he played it for Bruce and John Landau, and they're like, we love it. You're hired. So there you go.
There you go.
Should we throw it up into a few questions?
I guess so. Yeah.
We
go back to the official signal.
If we run out of questions, we can keep talking.
Nick here is commandeering things.
Hello. The Q&A mic is open. If anyone has a question, if you're still chewing on things, though, the gentleman can continue to talk. I think we might need a moment.
We got lots more to say.
Yeah. Go right ahead.
Do we? Yeah.
Of course.
So, I mean, one of the you were going to ask me about the lyric drafts. The loss that you mentioned.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, one of the things that's fascinating to me is the way you do take a song through its drafts. You mentioned this a little bit earlier. With how did you find some of this stuff? Is it?
That's sort of it's sort of both the easy part and the hard part. It's just that I've said it's interesting with like. So there's been Dylanology has been a thing for a long time. And of course, it was started by a guy who.
You're the A.J. Weberman.
Yeah, exactly.
Of Bruce.
Well, yeah, exactly.
That's an old school
exactly.
reference.
Yes. For the record, Dylanology was started by a madman who went through Dylan's garbage, and I do not approve of that. But then
literally went through his garbage.
Yeah, literally went through his garbage.
And
but. Actual Dylanology, as far as academic study of Dylan and close examination of his drafts and all that, has been going on for a long time. And there isn't as much of that with Bruce. And I think part of it is because the resources available to do it are just sort of becoming available. It's much easier with the internet to find stuff. So it's a few things. It's like there's some amazing stuff. A lot of amazing stuff is hiding in plain sight. Some of it is hiding in far less plain sight. So first of all, I'm sure this is not Bruce Springsteen's favorite thing that happened, but there's been intense interest in him for so long that many of his recordings, both home, amateur, and professional, that were not intended to be released, have been bootlegged. And that goes down to the sort of cassette tape, and I'm not talking about Nebraska where he had a fancy 4-track recorder. I'm talking about boombox recordings, little things that are way below demos. Like, it's a guy hitting record in his kitchen, the guy being Bruce, hitting record in his kitchen and like humming stuff over a chord progression, then hitting stop, and then starting to do some words, then literally whistling a riff over the thing, and then moving from there. And so there's
and you were able to find a lot of that stuff.
All that stuff is out there if you know where to look. Some of it's on YouTube, honestly, and some of it you have to dig deeper into some of the more illicit corners of the bootlegging world. But it was, for example, the Born USA stuff. The thing is, all this stuff, I saw a fan board where they were like, where did this come from? And I was like, it's the same bootlegs you have, you just didn't listen to them, because frankly, if you're not writing a book, even if you love Bruce Springsteen, it's a little bit boring to listen to 30 versions of Born USA as he's writing it. Like, no, it's hard to focus on unless you're, it's very interesting in an academic way, but not interesting as recreational listening. So it was a matter of, so in that case, it was literally listening. And the Born USA, and I cannot believe this, it's been there for all these years. No one noticed it. There's an early version of Born USA. It's actually, I guess, when it was still called Vietnam. There's a version when he says that he's talking about Richard Nixon. He's talking about the bombing of Cambodia, and he literally says that Richard Nixon's. Is my kid still here? Yeah. I'm gonna say a bad word. Bye, sweetie. You gonna leave? I actually might wait and tell this story in a minute. Wait, go ahead. That was perfect timing. He says a very bad thing should have happened to Richard Nixon. Let's just put it that way. So there's the recordings, and then there's the lyric sheets. And so what's cool is all these lyric sheets have gone out to, like, there's collectors who are buying and selling them at auction. And so there's a large number of just reproductions out there, some of which are just from the auction sites where they sold for like $10,000, but they still have the actual draft lyrics are still on the site, so you can read them. And then actually our friends at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame have a bunch too, and they gave me all of theirs. Some of them were in the Springsteen exhibit. So I got some stuff from there. I got stuff from, so there's a lot of it's out there. I think that someday he's giving all his manuscripts to the Monmouth University archive. And when that happens, there's going to be another opportunity for even a deeper scholarship. But there's tremendous, like you were asking about Lost in the Flood.
Another one of my favorite.
Yeah. But as with any kind of literary scholarship, looking at drafts can sometimes really be the key to unlock the meaning, because a lot of times what happens is there's a deliberate obfuscation that takes place as you go from draft to draft. And so something that you make super clear in the first draft, you actually kind of pull back from. And for example, when in Lost in the Flood, when he says the countryside's burning with Wolfman fairies, and that seems like in the abstract, at least to me sometimes that seemed like just sort of random Dylan-esque nonsense, but it's not at all. What it is it's free and direct writing from the point of view of a Vietnam veteran who just got back and is looking at bearded, long-haired hippies, and those are the Wolfman fairies. So that's and actually, I will say Bill Flanagan is a brilliant writer. He figured that out without even having the draft, and I'm like, oh, you're smarter than me, because I needed the draft. But so there's stuff like that,
Yeah, of course, Bruce he was one of those new Dylans in the early 70s, and did that come back to you in seeing all those sometimes overwritten early songs? Did you kind of say, okay, I see why people pegged him in that way?
Well, definitely. There's a lyrical style in the first album that he said he never returned to because it got pegged as Dylan-esque. It's sort of Dylan-esque. There's certain the ways you use adverbs and stuff that are. Broadly, what's more fascinating, and it's just pure talent, and it cannot be emulated, and no one should try. It's just what's crazy is how little reading he had done, and yet how literary the lyrics were. Later, he's done a tremendous amount of reading. He's now actually a very well-read human being, tremendously so. But back then, it was sort of like, it was like he reinvented poetry practically from scratch. He hadn't read. He knew what he knew was, but what he knew is he knew Astral Weeks. He knew Tim Buckley. He knew Dylan. And all that stuff. So he was drawing on lyrics, and he just had a poetic gift.
Yeah, you actually, the Tim Buckley connection.
Yeah, that's great. You wrote a book about Tim and Jeff Buckley. Yeah, I did
write Jeff and Tim Buckley, and I did not realize that Bruce Springsteen was a big Tim Buckley fan. What song is that with the explosion?
Yeah, so we're back to Lost in the Flood, actually. But yeah, so his album was called Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey. And of course, the Tim Buckley album, Greetings from LA, right?
LA, yeah, which
had just come out.
I had no idea that it was like an homage of some sort.
I'm fairly positive that, first of all, that's an homage, and second of all, so he went through. The thing is, in the first narratives of Bruce, and I got to meet and talk to Dave Marsh a couple weeks ago. And he was so nice and really complimentary about the book, which meant a lot because I started doing this because of him. But people like Dave Marsh established the first narratives, and I think Bruce helped them establish it. There was a sort of selective narrative where it's like, oh, he was only influenced by 50s and 60s rock and roll. He was like a pure creature of the jukebox with no sort of with no sort of impure influences from later stuff. But the actual Bruce Springsteen was a guy who had a King Crimson phase. He had a time when he was really into King Crimson. He had a big Tim Buckley phase. It was brief, but it was when he was first kind of playing songs in coffee houses, because he had a sort of a dual track career early on, even well before he was famous. Even when he was playing in bands, he started playing solo. And I think Tim Buckley probably wasn't the greatest influence on him. I think a lot of his more tuneless and ponderous early songs sort of came from that Tim Buckley thing. But to get specifically, it's a nutty thing. But basically, at the beginning of Lost in the Flood, there's a big booming, a sound that was interpreted as thunder. And what Steve Van Zandt told me is we knew it was him manhandling his amp. Specifically, Steve Van Zandt punched a guitar amp, and that's the sound you hear at the beginning of Lost in the Flood, which is, by the way, one of only two the closest thing to another appearance of an electric guitar on that whole album. Blinded by the Light is the only song on the whole album that has electric guitar, which is crazy. But that sound, I realized I'm blanking on the name, but there's a Tim Buckley anti-war song.
No Man Can Find the War.
Well, the man who wrote the book knows. So that song starts with the sound of an explosion.
Right. From a sound effects record. They didn't destroy any musical instruments, fella. They went straight to a sound effects record.
So, to be honest, this is one of those things I cannot remember for the life of me how I figured this out. I don't know. I guess I was digging through Tim Buckley records after. It's crazy, but suddenly I was like, oh my God, because the two Vietnam songs, two explosions, it was definitely a little nod to it, or a ripoff at least, but. So there you go.
And that reminds me of another unexpected connection, and you have to remind me of the song. There's a song on the Bruce cut, and the rhythm track was sort of inspired by Queen.
Oh yeah, well, so there's
the least likely.
I think it's a Wrecking Ball. It's a Wrecking Ball song, and I think it was there. I think it was Easy Money, but you'd have to look in the book to be sure. But it's basically like they were doing stomps to because they essentially Wrecking Ball was a homemade record. It was Ron and Bruce for the most part just making it, and so there weren't live drums on a lot of tracks. It was them layering percussion tracks, and they were doing stomps. And Ron was like, "We should have stomps like We Will Rock You, like Queen," and Bruce was like, "Don't say Queen, the Princess stomps," because I don't. We can only speculate. It's probably not like his favorite band. Let's face it.
Yeah, I can't imagine. The King Crimson kind of blows my mind that he was that Bruce had a secret prog phase.
Well, here's and I want to get back to CSMY, but you can the prog.
I want to stick with Bruce Springsteen's prog phase.
The prog makes more sense than you'd think, actually, because a lot of Bruce's first three records have a lot of songs, especially the second and third, have a lot of songs that can be seen as sort of like an Americanized R&B version of prog. They're long. They have multiple sections. There's a lot of stuff going on. And when I said that, I think so the person who agreed most with me on that was David Sanchez. So David Sanchez, the keyboardist on the first two E Street Band records. He and Boom Carter, who was briefly the drummer, he put on one studio track, Born to Run, and then decided it was a good time to leave the band. As Boom told me, it's not maybe the smartest decision in the history of the music business. But
every band has its Pete Best.
Exactly. So Boom and David Sanchez loved prog, and they loved what they saw, especially Jungle Land. They saw that as like kind of like a big prog song. When I said this to Roy Bittan, he was offended because I guess prog is a dirty word to him, and I was like, well, that's what they think. I mean, so I really don't think it's as nutty as you think when you really. It's just he found a much more kind of rootsy version of it, and when, I think that had all been erased from his mind. I remember when I asked him about the songs that have all these movements and stuff, he talked about Roy Orbison, which is kind of more on the official Bruce track.
Yeah.
Because but I mean, I only know about King Crimson because he talked about it. It's not like it's some secret information. But I think he revealed the King Crimson thing in that wonderful conversation he had with Steve Van Zandt on the Underground Garage, where there was a lot of that's very revealing and worth listening to, because they go through every 45 they each bought in the early 60s, and the order in which they bought them, and it's tremendously illuminating. I want to ask about the kind of ins and outs again of the discography, because one of the things you do, since you for many years you were a rock critic, and in addition to being a great reporter, is really shed some light on some of the overlooked moments that actually are really good in their catalog. In their very wide catalog, because some of them, as you said, are like Nash and Stills or whatever, just partial combinations. But what is the best stuff that people neglect?
I think one of the problems, but things that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had to deal with, especially Crosby, Stills and Nash, is that they were so big and mythological so quickly. When they broke up a year later in 1970, they were sort of gods and so forth, and so it cast a pall over like everything else that they did. So people, it was really interesting how people took their breakup very personally. When they broke up in 1970, there would be like a fan who went up to Graham Nash at one of the shows when there were rumors they were breaking up, and it was like, please don't break up, we need you, because they were like they were like the new Beatles or something in some way, and they were writing songs like Ohio and things like that really spoke to that generation and what was going on. So I think when they broke up, the first of many times, at least 8 times, according to one person who worked with them, I think people tended to ignore some of those records that they made because all their names weren't on the covers. And also the record company also didn't actively promote the solo albums because they wanted them to get back together. So it was a very
actually, that's a really interesting point. So these were these were like completely sabotaged records from the start.
Yeah, not completely, but yes, the record company didn't promote them. But even so, the first couple of Stephen Stills records, including one called Manassas, which was a double album in 1972, where he had formed a band, and they played everything from blues to country to Latin music to rock and roll. It was kind of his masterpiece in a way. He really got to show all of his strengths. Graham Nash has a couple of solo albums called Songs for Beginners and Wild Tales that are both really good. There's a Crosby Nash record called Wind on the Water from 1975. I learned something about that. That title song was about whales who were killed for perfume and things like that. And so I asked Nash about that, and he said, yes, but actually the whale is also Crosby, because he was getting harpooned by the press. And I said, really?
That's the only reason.
I've never, and this is one thing I've also learned, one of the things about this group that was fascinating to me was that they kind of lived their lives publicly in a way that a lot of rock stars didn't, especially in the 70s. They dissed each other in interviews openly, starting with the time around 1970 when Stephen Stills referred to Crosby Nash as his backup singers. Didn't go over well. And then they would write songs. They would write songs about each other and put them on records instead of having conversations. And I asked Graham Nash about that, who did it the most. And I said, why did you do that? He said, well, sometimes it's easier than talking. So like he would write a song about Stills called Frozen Smiles, about his cocaine problem. And the first example of that, which always amuses me, was Chicago, which is the song that Nash wrote about the Democratic Convention in '68 and all the riots and the trial of the hippies, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and all those folks. And he played it on a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young live album called The 4-Way Street. And the line in the song is, won't you please come to Chicago just to sing? Now, I grew up hearing that song thinking this was his call for everyone in the country to rise up and support the hippies, and support this who had been clobbered by cops during that convention. But actually what happened was Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had been asked to do a benefit for the hippies. And Stills and Young didn't want to do it for some reason. So that song the "you" is Stills and Young. It was like, won't you please come to, it wasn't like asking the country. It was like, no, can you guys in the band do this show? And when I asked Nash about it, he admitted this is true. And I said, well, how did they react to this? Would they ever say anything to you about it? He goes, no, they've never said anything to me about that. I'm like, do they know it's about them? He's like, I don't know. Like, that is grade A dysfunction right there. And you write a song about someone and you play it on stage with them, and they might not even know it's about them. It's hilarious.
I had one more for you about David Crosby, which is when I once... years ago, I talked to him just on the phone for our 1968 issue, and I very casually asked him about the day he was fired from the Byrds. And he actually almost hung up on me because he was so upset by the question. And I was like, really? This guy's still upset about being fired from the Byrds? But was there ever anything that, because he's sensitive, was there ever anything that bugged him in all the delicate subjects you had to talk about?
He still has a really hard time talking about his girlfriend, Christine Hinton, who was killed in a car accident right before Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were making their first album together, Deja Vu. He still has a really hard time putting himself there, and even the little details, like that she was driving his green VW Bug, and she was on the way to the vet, and she had a friend in the next seat next to her who was holding their cat, and the cat jumped out of the friend's lap onto Christine, who was driving, and drove right into a bus and was killed. And that was a traumatic moment for him. He was driven to the hospital to identify the body. He passed the VW on the side of the road with blood still on the street, and he had to identify the body. And he put her ashes in a Halliburton case and spread them in the Bay Area and the Golden Gate Bridge. He still has trouble talking about that. He'll talk about tons of other things, but that's still after 50 years this September.
One of the things that I took away was that a lot of his like sort of terrible behavior seemed to be a reaction to that, actually.
Yeah, he had bad behavior before, for sure.
But it got worse.
He was a bad boy, but it got worse. Yeah, he felt really guilty, and he drowned himself in lots of things. And I have one question for you, Brian. So Bruce is working on a new record, right? We've been hearing for several years now he's working on some kind of a non-E Street Band singer-songwriter record.
I don't, anything I do know I couldn't say, and anything, but no, I mean...
Turn off the cameras.
Yeah, no, I think, I really don't know. I talked to a couple of the musicians I talked to from his past, actually, I mean, I think I can say, I mean, the David Sanchez plays on that record, apparently. Mm-hmm. Or that doesn't mean he's going to be on the finished thing, but he of course, but he did play with him, which is, it's not the first time he's been brought back in the camp. And all I heard is just kind of what Bruce has been saying, what Ron, there's actually, it's fairly well, it's Andy who's in the audience once asked Bruce about it. It's basically, it sounds like a really interesting kind of orchestral singer-songwriter record. And it sounds like
Tim Buckley record.
Yeah, sure. Maybe this is where the Tim Buckley stuff finally comes out. Lord help us. So we'll see. I mean, it sounds like it's been done for quite some time. And it also, I mean, as Bruce said, I'm not breaking any news here. I mean, he said I'm not. He said he's not touring with the E Street Band because he's got several recording projects he's working on. So he's definitely been busy. It's just people haven't heard what he's working on. So I think we're all anxious to hear that.
So, and then the last question is, when that record comes out, are you gonna have to redo your book?
If they let me, maybe I'll post it online. We'll see. Yeah.
Online excerpts.
David, Brian, thank you for having this discussion with us tonight. Y'all ready to sign some books?
Sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That was the
Is that what we're here for?
answer I was hoping for. All right, everyone. I think we might be able to do this. If you feel able and willing and you got a book to get signed, go ahead and start the line at this speaker where I'm pointing right here on house left, stage right, and just